Good afternoon, and welcome to our episode 3 of our COVID-19 Religion and Belief webinar series. Today, our speakers will focus on civil society, and the panel will be chaired by Dr. Judd Birdsall, Director of the Cambridge Institute for Religious and International Studies. Before I say anything else, I invite you to respond to the live poll that I just launched to give you and our speakers an idea of our global audience. So thank you in advance. For your information, this webinar is being recorded and live streamed on social media. The recording will be available on our series landing page, where we also publish information about upcoming episodes, and you can see the link in the chat. You can ask and upvote questions at any time using the Q&A tool on the bottom of your screen, and that will allow you to engage with our speakers and our panel. If you get disconnected, just use the link that you have just received when you registered to join back in. Finally, I would like to recognize the sponsoring institutions of this webinar series: the Cambridge Institute on Religion and International Studies, the Center for Religious Studies at Bruno Kessler Foundation, the Center for Justice and Society at Fundação Getúlio Vargas Law School, Rio de Janeiro, the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University Law School, the European Union Office of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the University of Siena. I will now broadcast the results of the live poll and then leave the rest of the time to Judd for the panel. Judd, the time is yours.
Great. Thank you, Francesco. I'm grateful to you and to all of our co-sponsoring organizations for making these webinars possible. And thanks to all of you who are joining this call from around the world. As we see on the poll results just now, I very much look forward to our conversation during our hour together. Well, we're gathered today virtually to consider the urgent matter of the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on civil society, and particularly on religious and belief organizations and their rights. On the positive side, we've seen many religious and belief organizations respond in constructive ways, finding new and creative methods of addressing the needs of their people and responding in this time of crisis. We've seen groups collaborate with one another, partner alongside multilateral institutions and governments to help elevate messages around personal hygiene, physical distancing, social solidarity. There's been plenty of examples of people who have been inspired by their faith and their convictions to respond to the crisis in all sorts of generous and even heroic ways. And thankfully, we've seen plenty of governments that have responded with well-considered, well-measured, non-discriminatory restrictions on civil society, including religious gatherings. Unfortunately, on the negative side, we've seen lots of religious actors respond in less than constructive ways. Individuals and groups that spread misinformation or conspiracy theories, or resist even very temporary commonsensical restrictions on religious gatherings. We've seen a rise in racist and xenophobic attitudes and expressions, and we've seen too many governments use this present crisis as a pretext for consolidating power, for scapegoating minorities and immigrants, and for further constricting the space for civil society, including religious and belief groups. So to help us think through what's going on, why it's happening, and what can be done to help preserve and defend the rights of civil society groups during this time, we've assembled a diverse panel of experts representing Jewish, humanist, Baha'i, and Christian organizations. And it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists now. Rochelle Bayani is a representative of the Baha'i international community at their regional office in Brussels. Kristen Broker is the Deputy Director of the Jacob Blaustein Institute for the Advancement of Human Rights at the American Jewish Committee. Giovanni Gaetani is the Membership Engagement Manager at Humanists International. And Patrick Schnabel is a lecturer in Potsdam University and a member of the thematic group on human rights for the Council of European Churches. So welcome to all of our panelists. Thank you for being with us. Each of our panelists will speak for about 5 or so minutes, and then we'll use the remainder of our time together for Q&A. If you have a question that comes to mind during our panelists' presentations, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can type your question there. Please be as succinct as possible, just a couple of lines, and let us know to whom you are addressing your question. And Francesco and I and others will be monitoring the Q&A as it comes in, and then I'll try to direct the questions to each of our panelists. Well, there's no particular order in which our panelists should present, so we thought we'll just go in order that they're listed on the invitation email. So that's Rochelle, Kristen, Giovanni, and then Patrick. So first over to Rochelle, floor is yours.
Many thanks, Judd, and many thanks to the organizers for really having put this together. Just a few thoughts, and Judd, you summarized them very well, but really, despite the many challenges, we all know them and we see them, and I will get to one of them in relation to the Baha'i community in Iran also, but we're also seeing how much we can learn from this situation, including about the role of faith or belief communities. And there's two elements I want to highlight, and of course there's many more, but really the reality of humanity's interconnectedness and oneness has become so much clearer to many, with people asking themselves what the next stage in our collective lives will look like. We have been shown the limits of a system that places national sovereignty as its cornerstone. We're seeing that the interest of one nation is intrinsically linked with that of another and with the global community as a whole. And we're seeing that our current system of governance needs to be profoundly rethought and reshaped. Of course, an immediate tendency resulting from this would be, and sort of to see what could be a lesson learned, would be to address, practical matters of policy, resource utilization, planning, implementation. But really, the revisiting of this current order requires much more fundamental changes. It will require re-examination of the attitudes and assumptions which underlie it, and it will require an ongoing sort of conversation about what those attitudes are and what those assumptions are. What is our assumption about human nature? What do we mean by well-being? What does societal progress entail? And that conversation needs to be had with everyone at all levels, and also involve faith and belief communities who, by their very nature, are thinking about those very questions all the time. Secondly, sort of if we look at this global current order, we also see that it rests on a very particular conception of human nature. And not to want to sort of caricaturize, but it's a conception that is quite materialistic in the sense that humans are portrayed as sort of passive consumers, economic units, and we're told that happiness comes from the pursuit of material well-being. So, of course, many of us don't think like that, but if you look at the global order as our economy, at our sort of the way we shape things, that's very much the conception of human nature. And there you see that the current crisis has really highlighted the irreplaceable role and contribution of the individual to our society. And we're seeing countless acts of service, resilience, selflessness, creativity exhibited all over the earth. And individuals are testifying that they can be protagonists in constructing communities that are characterized by cooperation, mutual aid, and reciprocity. And the extent to which individuals have been enabled to be protagonists really becomes a direct indicator of a community's resilience, particularly in times of this. So beyond ensuring sort of the provision of material means and maintaining institutional structures, an essential dimension of a well-being or of a well-functioning society relates to its ability to see the great masses of humanity living in cities, towns, and villages as representing a vast reservoir of capacity, and to really foster and tap into that capacity to build new patterns of collective life. And here we see that faith communities all over the world, alongside other types of communities, can play a crucial role. And as a Baha'i community, we have this news service. And in there, I'm seeing all the time what Baha'i communities throughout the world with their friends are really doing. And the latest stories have been obviously about this pandemic. And I wanted to just share some example. Now, there are thousands of other beautiful examples from different type of communities out there, faith and non-faith, but this is really just to give a glimpse of the nature of contribution that a community can make and that individuals within that community can make. And one of them that has been particularly striking is the role of the youth. And we've seen youth take on a role that really is not just sort of a decorative role, but it is essential in advancing a society. So, for example, one of the examples I've seen is in the US and Virginia, and again, there's many others, that where youth have noticed that parents from certain communities don't speak English, and so that they haven't been able to access school programs for their children. And they're saying that first they thought this was related to internet access, but then they understood that it's not. It's because they don't understand what the sort of school arrangements were. So here in this case, and these are youth that are already part of certain educational activities outside of their school, have really been that sort of link between the school, between the institution, if you like, and the people. Another story that I thought was quite interesting is in Vanuatu. Vanuatu is, we know, is an island in the Pacific. And although they have no confirmed cases of the coronavirus so far, the effects on international travel and trade have caused economic hardship and reduced food imports. So here again, you have some Baha'is and their collaborators who are in a program called Preparation for Social Action that have taken steps. And this is an ongoing program, but it enabled them to quickly act during a time of this, and really have been trying to expand personal gardens and plant crops that can be harvested quickly, so to create reliable sources of food for the coming months. In India, Baha'is have assisted the local police to run public information campaigns about preventative health measures. Others in Assam, Gujarat, Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal are coordinating efforts to prepare and distribute thousands of bags of foods to citizens. So here again, you see really communities are this missing link between sort of in a society where mainly a role has been sort of attributed to institutions. And this makes us think, what is the future role of sort of individuals and communities in our society? And what can we really learn from this particular moment? Now, briefly about the Baha'is in Iran. So as we know, at all times, you have Baha'is in Iran are being sort of arrested and imprisoned. Now, of course, Iran has released a number of prisoners of conscience, among which a few Baha'is, but has also others remain in prison. So really one thing we call for is that these individuals, they are innocent, they shouldn't have been imprisoned in the first place, but to really, we're calling on the Iranian government to sort of release them, because they're also placing their lives in considerable danger right now. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Rochelle, for those reflections, as well as for the very concrete examples of encouraging responses. Straight over now to Kristen at the American Jewish Committee.
Thank you very much, Judd, and thanks to all of you for tuning in and for the invitation to participate in this important discussion. As it's been mentioned, I'm with the American Jewish Committee's Jacob Blaustein Institute for the Advancement of Human Rights, and so my remarks today focus mainly on the work that we are doing within JBI, but I don't want to neglect attention to the important activities that the other members of my organization around the world are doing in the context of this pandemic, particularly to create networks and collaborate across interfaith, intergroup, and international networks of expressions of solidarity and expressions of resilience at a time when all of us are facing unprecedented challenges. At JBI, we particularly focus on human rights and increasing the protection of human rights globally through the United Nations and through its human rights and its professional and intergovernmental mechanisms. It's clear to everyone that the pandemic poses an unprecedented threat to human rights, both in terms of its scope and to the quantity, the number of rights that are being impacted negatively for people around the world, and the consequences that the necessary mitigation measures are having on people's ability to enjoy their rights. Restrictions on mass gatherings, social distancing requirements, travel restrictions, movement restrictions, all of these obviously limit the ability of Jews and others to manifest their religious beliefs in community with others, to receive and conduct religious education, to hold weddings, funerals, other religious celebrations, and engage in key religious practices that are vital to their life, to their well-being, to their sense of community, and to their ability to be resilient during this difficult time. Emergency measures in some places around the world have actually gone so far as to not only curtail the ability of religious people to practice their beliefs, but that violate them. We have had a handful of countries where there have been either proposed or enacted requirements requiring victims of the virus to be cremated, for example. And this practice is inconsistent with religious beliefs of many. We know that the right to freedom of religion or belief is not absolute. We know it can be restricted to protect public health and the rights of others, and of course the right to life, as long as the restrictions are necessary, proportionate, and not applied in a manner that discriminates against a particular religious group. And in light of the seriousness of the pandemic and the risks that it's posing, the vast majority of religious communities have complied voluntarily with these movement restrictions. They have adapted their religious practices to meet these challenges. They have devised ways of engaging in essential religious activities, sometimes actively in cooperation with governments, to do so either virtually or in ways that allow them to do so while adhering to social distancing guidelines. And this has been the trend in the vast majority of cases. But we are concerned that the restrictions on the right to freedom of belief and the challenges facing religious minority communities are greater than this. In a number of countries, there have been cases where we've seen direct and indirect discrimination against religious minority groups, including in access to healthcare and in access to technology and services that are necessary to take part in online religious services and education. And we're also concerned that there have been allegations that authorities have been disproportionately harshly enforcing measures against certain religious communities in certain countries, in part because of their visibility relative to other individuals who are failing to adhere to necessary social distancing guidelines. In a number of places, we've seen religious minority communities being stigmatized and accused of being particularly responsible for spreading the virus, both in traditional and in online media. And this includes anti-Semitic hate speech. We've seen it in countries around the world, in a list of countries that I can see before me that is on all continents, and in countries that do and do not have Jewish communities alike, in which claims that Jews or that Israel engineered or is deliberately spreading the virus have been spread by influential people, by politicians, by religious leaders, and others. In some cases, anti-Semitic speech has reached the level of harassment and threats of violence against Jewish people, communities, and institutions. And in a handful of cases that we have, mostly in the United States so far, there have been attempted violent attacks against Jewish sites, most recently in Massachusetts, I believe, a week or two ago. And these attacks seem to, initial reports suggest that they do have a connection to online activity, in particular that they were being encouraged by white supremacists on social media platforms. These attacks, moreover, aren't solely threatening Jewish communities and individuals. In an earlier case, it was targeted at a hospital treating patients of the outbreak of all religions. So at AJC, as I mentioned, we're focused on the United Nations, at making it more effective, at promoting respect for human rights, generally speaking. And the pandemic has, as Rachel mentioned, has made it all the more clear that a multilateral response and multilateral cooperation is essential to deal with a threat like this. And we've been seeing signs of hope from the United Nations and from its senior leadership in the last few months, that they were already, prior to the pandemic, committed to reorienting the organization more effectively towards protecting the rights of minority communities around the world, to combating anti-Semitism in particular, and to taking on hate speech in a way that respects the right to freedom of expression as well, since it's equally vital for religious minorities and others. We have been calling for UN leaders to take a human rights approach to combating the pandemic and its social and economic consequences. And we have seen responses from the UN in the last 3 weeks that have done so. A statement by the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief yesterday about the rise in intolerance against religious minorities of all kinds. Last week, he issued a standalone statement about the threat of anti-Semitic hate speech in particular. The Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, who has a particular role in the United Nations as coordinating its response to hate speech, has been developing guidance for all UN personnel in the field and all the countries where it works to address the threat of hate speech and stigmatization of religious minority communities in the context of the pandemic that we hope will be ruled out very soon. And the Secretary General released a report on human rights in the context of the pandemic this morning, actually. And it also expresses concern about the full gamut of human rights consequences of the pandemic, but does address the subjects of stigmatization, hate speech, and threats to religious and other minority communities as well. The human rights approach is so important because not only does it stress the need for restrictions to be tailored, to be proportionate and necessary and applied in a non-discriminatory way, but it also puts an emphasis on the need for communication and the need for information sharing. It's essential that authorities enforce anti-discrimination laws despite the fact that there is a public health emergency, and that they continue to monitor and document hate crimes when they occur. In order to do this, they need to have effective channels of communication with religious minority communities. And those same channels of communication are the ones that would enable them to share information about why social distancing requirements are necessary, and to devise solutions with religious communities to allow them to carry out necessary activities while not jeopardizing the right to health of their own communities and the broader public. We also appreciate that the UN's focus on hate speech focuses on the need to condemn hate speech, the need for public leadership consistently doing so, the need to show solidarity and collaboration with targeted religious communities, and to call on social media companies to enforce their own terms of service, but at the same time not to take overbroad measures that restrict the right to freedom of expression or that criminalize speech that should be protected, or take advantage of the crisis to stifle the spread of information that is so necessary. It also calls for education and for training of public officials and of the broader public on religious intolerance and on the need for responses to hate speech. And the same educational channels here can also be vital, again, in establishing a relationship of trust with the communities that are being targeted today. So that's what our work has focused on. We are pleased with the progress that we've seen so far from the UN, and what we're hoping now is to put it into action. And we know, the UN is not a cure-all for domestic situations that are very different in each country context, but the message that we're seeing from the multilateral institution now about the importance of safeguarding the rights of religious minority communities, but doing so in a way that respects the rights of everyone, I think has been very positive. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Kristen, for your intervention and also for the good work you're doing to promote tolerance and human rights during this time. Now straight over to Giovanni.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. I will do something unusual. I will make a presentation. I will try to stick to 5 minutes, but Judd, please stop me if I'm running over time. So as a really small introduction about our community, I'm here on behalf of Humanists International, and it's important to define what is the global humanist community, because sometimes might not be clear. We are a very liberal and heterogeneous movement. We come from very different backgrounds, uh, humanist, atheist, agnostics, skeptics, rationalist, ethical union, and so on. It's also very difficult to estimate the numbers of humanists all around the world. We can stick to the Pew Research Center survey from 2010, which says that non-affiliated people, non-religious people, are 16% of the population worldwide, 1.1 billion, which is the third group beyond Christians and Muslims. But it's not enough to have a lack of belief to be part of this humanist community. It's not enough to simply don't believe in God. You need also to agree with a common set of values. And this common set of values, it's included in the Amsterdam Declaration, which is our statement defining modern humanism. And these are our values: reason, science, democracy, secularism, human rights, universalism, empathy, solidarity, freedom, and so on. Why did I make this presentation? Because in order to reply to Judd's question, how does the pandemic affect the global humanist community, I can reply, all these values are in danger, are at risk right now. The main effect of this pandemic is to jeopardize all values we believe in. So what I want to say is that we have a lot of bad news for humanists during this pandemic, but there are also some good news. Let's start from the bad news. The first one is that we are here to talk about freedom of religion or belief, which includes also freedom from religion. Well, freedom from religion right now is at risk more than ever. And for us as non-religious, freedom from religion is fundamental. Let me make some clear example from real life. We have a group called Council of Ex-Muslims in Sri Lanka. Well, in Sri Lanka, in some part of Sri Lanka, you cannot be openly atheist, especially in the Muslim majority zones. And these ex-Muslims are right now forced to live with families or with groups of people, and they cannot show their atheism and humanism openly. So they are atheists in the closet. And right now they are forced to pray five times a day with their families. And this is a clear example of how freedom for religion is at risk. But also in many parts of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, we have seen an increase in accusation of witchcraft. Basically, alleged witches are accused of spreading the virus, and humanists are doing what they can to save them, while at the same time we are seeing some Christian missionary groups exploiting this situation to save those witches by converting them to Christianity. But also, before the pandemic, we were helping a lot of humanists at risk, people running away from persecution, from accusation of blasphemy, accusation of apostasy. Well, right now, their situation is even worse because it's like frozen. Embassies are closed. They cannot relocate internally or externally. And so, as Rachel said, we have many prisoners of conscience in Iran, but also in Saudi Arabia, in Pakistan, and most of those prisoners of conscience are humanists. This was the first bad news, but it doesn't stop here because secularism is at risk as well. We have seen a reinforcement of religious privilege in Italy, Colombia, US, and many other countries, let alone theocracies. And in this situation, we as humanist individuals and as humanist organizations, we are even more voiceless than before. the final effect is that we as non-religious are a further invisible minority within religious and belief minorities. Final bad news is that in general, as Kristen said, all human rights are at risk. We are facing a U-turn of history. Let's take, for example, free speech. Free speech is the cause of this pandemic because China lost 11 days at the very beginning of the pandemic, not stopping the virus, but rather stopping the spreading of the outbreak. China silenced the doctor who were denouncing the start of the pandemic, and here we are. Some attendee asked, what's the situation in Hungary? The situation in Hungary is very scary because right now, Viktor Orban claimed full power and made the famous coronavirus coup. And this is just one example of how democracy can be destroyed by this pandemic. Women's rights. We have seen in Poland last week, the parliament was trying to ban sex education in schools and to further restrict abortion laws. In a moment where it's impossible for feminists, humanists to go down to the street and protest. But thanks to some brave people, the two bills are stopped right now. These were the bad news. The good news is that all those values that are at risk are also the values that will save us, that will help us to overcome from this pandemic. There are some politicians all over the world. I'm Italian, so I can think about Matteo Salvini. They say science is not enough. I say we don't have enough science, actually. We need more science. And so we need evidence-based information to limit the contagion, more resource to laboratories researching a vaccine, and to fight fake news, we need a proper scientific and clear information. We need more international cooperation. We need to avoid what the US are doing right now, cutting the funds to the World Health Organization, because nationalism and populism can only make things worse. We need coordination globally because the virus doesn't care about national boundaries. So the last message is this one: we need empathy. We need to go over our differences because who is really affected in this pandemic is the most vulnerable ones, the poorest, women. We have seen an increase in domestic violence. And also because what we are doing right now will be very important when we will be back to normality. The humanity we will be able to show right now will mean a lot later on. So it's time to show compassion and tolerance despite our differences. And the humanist message to the world is the same as one: together as one. So I think it was 5 minutes, and here I am.
Great. Thank you so much, Giovanni, for that very clear presentation. Much appreciated. And now finally over to Patrick.
Thank you. I'm speaking here today on behalf of the Conference of European Churches. This is a fellowship of around 120 churches from the Orthodox, Anglican, Old Catholic and Protestant traditions. We have offices in Brussels and in Strasbourg, and work through different thematic groups, and one group is on human rights. And today I'm presenting a paper that we've drafted over the last 2 weeks, looking at the implications of the pandemic on freedom of religion and belief, in particular in Europe, but I think the same things also apply to other regions of our world. Let me first say that we are very aware that churches have many more things to say in this situation than just talk about freedom of religion or belief. And the Conference of European Churches is also looking at all these other issues because we are very afraid that despite trying to talk about physical distancing, a lot of social distancing in the more worrying sense of the word does happen. For example, on the German television, we just had a scene shown that an elderly woman fell down a young woman tried to help her, and just out of fear of being infected, the woman preferred to lie down and try to get up without help. So a lot of fear is coming in that takes people apart. We have had nurses being refused to be served in supermarkets when they wear their nurses' uniforms because people were afraid of infection. And obviously we have a lot of people living on the streets, being forced to live in situations of domestic violence, where religious communities and other communities of faith and belief are in urgent need to respond and find ways of bridging social gaps that are reappearing or deepening now. But our working group especially looked at the situation of church communities and of freedom of religion and belief for all, because we must say that this virus has shown a very bad timing, if I may say so. We have had Easter in the Western and the Orthodox traditions, there's Pesach, there's Ramadan. So a lot of the religious celebrations of the world religions, of many world religions, fall into this time of physical distancing and restrictions of social life in our societies. Freedom of assembly doesn't happen, or is restricted to a huge extent. So we've been trying to look at what we can advise our communities to say, to do, how to act, how to respond to all these restrictions. And I think the first very serious and very important message that we have to convey is do take this serious challenge seriously. This is not about visiting the church or any temple. This is not about your personal feeling, whether you are a risk group or not. This is about saving those who are at risk, and that can only be achieved if everyone sticks to the rules. That's the first very basic message to everyone, because we need to allow our national health systems to keep up with the rate of infection and to treat the number of people falling ill at any one time. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that, of course, we need to monitor in our democratic societies the actions of government. And it has been pointed out by Kristen that, of course, all measures, even if they are necessary, they still have to be suitable and proportionate, and that needs to be monitored. And obviously, religious groups, as any other bearers of fundamental rights, are in a need to monitor whether their rights, the rights of others, are being infringed in a way that is not proportionate anymore. And having said that, we believe that there's some doubt that all measures are always proportionate or always taking the necessity of equal treatment seriously. Now, for example, in my country, DIY centers had been open all the time, while it hadn't been possible to hold any sort of service, even open air. So you see, equal treatment is a bit difficult in some of the situations, but we are well aware that politicians were in an easy situation. They had to take ad hoc measures, and if you have to take ad hoc measures, it's really very difficult to figure out if everything is done in the proper and a suitable and a well thought through way. Ad hoc actions can be faulty, but the answer to that, and that is very important, that's the second very strong message that we want to convey to our constituency, is that the wrong answer would be to show faulty, a very difficult understanding of civil disobedience and say, look, this doesn't look convincing to me, so I don't follow the rules. The only possible way is to exercise another fundamental right, and that is to seek legal protections and have courts evaluate the measures. And we had, I'm talking again, sitting in Berlin from the German background, cases going up to the Constitutional Court, asking if the measures were proportionate, and the court said yes, for a short moment it is acceptable to limit even freedom of religion or belief to the extent that no services at all can be held in community, but that needs to be monitored basically every day, and the government needs to be aware that this restriction should be loosened as soon as possible to the extent that seems to be responsible at any given time. So I think this is very important. And the third message that we wanted to convey to our constituents in this situation is, do not perceive of these measures as being aimed at limiting freedom of religion or belief. They are safeguarding measures for individual health and for the integrity of our national health systems. They restrict many fundamental rights, basically all fundamental rights that have an aspect of community, of gathering, of assembly, of association to them. This is not a situation in which any religious group is discriminated against. We are just falling victim to the need to restrict social interaction, as many other groups do that want to exercise their fundamental rights in our European societies. So with these three basic messages and the considerations behind them, we urge our member churches to take a responsible approach in dealing with their governments and the restrictions that are being put in place. And with that, I close my presentation at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick, and thanks to all of our panelists for their excellent and timely interventions. We now have 19 minutes for Q&A, and we'll try to use that as efficiently as we can. I've been noting some of the questions that have been coming in. Other panelists and co-sponsoring organizations have been typing some responses in response to those questions. A couple that I've flagged here. One is the situation in Hungary, which Giovanni also mentioned. What's being done, what are NGOs doing with the European Commission and the European Parliament to protect for, but this time there's also a question about is this crisis feeding right-wing populism and extremism, a kind of populism that plays on conservative religiosity. So questions that I've jotted down, I'm sure others will come in. As you think of questions, do be as succinct as possible, just a couple of lines if you can, and let us know to whom you are addressing that question. Patrick, I wonder if we could start with you on this question about Hungary and perhaps some other places in Europe where we're seeing some worrying signs. What role can or is the CEC playing in engaging with Christian communities in these countries where we're seeing some perhaps discriminatory constrictions of civil society?
Well, the situation in Hungary is one that all actors in Europe have been monitoring for a long time. And we are very worried about some of the developments. And we see that the government uses this situation to tighten the grip on civil society, to make the shrinking space even smaller. And of course, we support our churches, our member churches in Hungary, in their attempts to keep space open. But as an organization, as an umbrella organization, we act not without a concrete question for help from a specific member church, and at the moment we haven't had such a specific request. So what we do is we inform about human rights, we encourage our member churches to live their rights, to make it visible, and to inform us about any infringements, and come up with questions what and how we can help, and in that case we'll do that.
Great, thank you. Question for Rochelle, and perhaps also for
can I add something?
Giovanni, you want to respond to that as well?
Yeah, on Hungary, I just want to say that one of the first acts of Viktor Orban was to seek to ban legal recognition of transgender people. So you see that it's a very slippery slope case. So first democracy, then LGBT rights, and then God knows what. So just this.
Rochelle or Kristen, did you want to weigh in on the Hungary question? Okay. Rochelle, and perhaps also Francesco, there was the question about how NGOs are engaging with the European Parliament and the European Commission to protect FORB at this time. I know both of you are very active in that space in Brussels. Do you want to comment on that?
I think Francesco wrote a good answer to that question. But generally speaking, both Francesco and myself were part of the European Platform Against Religious Intolerance and Discrimination. And within that context, we also try to sort of raise the situation of various religious communities and of the right of FORB more generally with the institutions. But maybe Francesco, who's currently on the board, can talk more to that.
Thank you. Thank you, Rochelle. Thank you, Judd. So I tried to attempt an answer on the question that Daniel asked. As a church, we haven't submitted any specific policy recommendation when it comes to the COVID-19 and the pandemic situation. But as this webinar series is one of our efforts to engage on the topic, and we will the way we try to address the issue with the European Union institutions is also part of these efforts with the seminar, with this webinar series. But when it comes to work on freedom of religion or belief, we as an office have been very engaged on with the institutions through the tools that they have for churches and civil society to address these issues, as is part of our major portfolio. Rochelle also mentioned the European Platform Against Religious Intolerance and Discriminations, which is a platform of both religious and non-religious organizations, which I'm a member of the board. And we constantly work with members of the European Parliament, the Commission, and the European External Action Service to address this, the issue of freedom of religion or belief, which includes, of course, to all, for both religious people and non-religious people. Back to you.
Great, thanks to both of you for your comments on that. So now that this question about whether the pandemic and the response to it is feeding a sort of right-wing extremism that plays on conservative religiosity. I think one of the questions people have been asking in the context of the pandemic, is it going to draw out our better angels or the demons inside of us? Is it going to help us to think more universally, or is it going to force communities or compel communities to think only about themselves and to be suspicious of outsiders and people from other countries or other faiths? I wonder if there's a comment on that, and perhaps what more religious communities and faith belief communities can be doing to bring out those elements within their traditions that would help us to become more universal and compassionate in our approach to this pandemic. Kristen, could I bring you in in responding to that question?
Sure. I don't want to be narrow in my focus, but I do think there's a risk that the more that the institutions that we have established prove to be, especially multilateral institutions, are inadequately responding in the face of the crisis, or don't appear to be functioning in a way that's effective and protective and actually making a difference in people's lives, the more we'll see people turn away from them and turn inward, nationalism or even, subnationally, in a dangerous way. And so I think one objective that both I and my colleagues at AJC more broadly have had is to engage, again, this is a New York perspective, but diplomats at the United Nations to try and communicate with as many people as possible. I mean, AJC has a webinar series that they have been engaging in that's been very active and increasingly includes conversations with UN officials. We've been really concerned about the relative paralysis of the intergovernmental bodies of the UN and the positive actions that I cited in my my remarks have all come from the professional staff and from independent experts. There's been very little movement by states, and the part of that is just this dislocation, and part of it reflects political polarization as well. Part of it reflects problems that existed prior to the pandemic, but that have been exacerbated by it. And I think one role that we see ourselves playing is stressing the importance of multilateralism at this moment, showing and prodding multilateral institutions to communicate at the very least that they understand what people are facing, and then at the very best, urgently start performing in a way that is visible to everyone, that is clearly helping mitigate the risk and mitigate the consequences of this pandemic, whether it be through provision of development and humanitarian assistance to the countries that are least capable of dealing with the crisis, or through engaging religious leaders in countries around the world, through engaging the non-state actors that are also playing an important role in this, like from my perspective, social media companies. There's so much that could be done, and that's what I think would be one counterweight to the tendency to turn inward and to reject solidarity. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. Do other panelists want to weigh in on that topic? Not seeing any hands up. Let me move to another question that's come in, and that is this issue of a spike in domestic abuse being spurred by the isolation that people are undergoing now, confined to their homes, often in abusive situations. What can or what are religious and belief groups doing to help combat domestic abuse during a time like this? And maybe just raise your hand if you want to speak to that question, so I know who to call on. Great, first to Giovanni.
I think I was the one who brought up this issue. And I mean, it's really, really hard to do anything, because the situation right now for victims of abuse, domestic abuse, especially women, is basically frozen, because you are locked with your husband or wife, and there's no way to ask for help. Some governments all around the world are activating a helpline. They are increasing their support for victims of domestic abuse. But truth is, in such a lockdown situation, it's impossible to find a new place to stay. It's really hard to escape for such a toxic relationship. So I'm afraid my reply is very pessimistic. And yes, we can appeal to our empathy and sense of humanity, but it's hard. That's everything.
Great. Anyone else want to speak to that question of domestic abuse? Okay. There's another question that's come in about how we continue to advance freedom of religion or belief at a time when we're all confined to our homes. There's, even before the pandemic, many cases of repression and intolerance and persecution around the world that continue to need to be addressed. How can we address those situations while we're confined to our houses? Are there best practices or case studies of successes that people are finding virtually to promote FORB during the pandemic? Anyone like to take a crack at answering that? Maybe Rachel, if I could call on you again. There's very specific cases of Baha'i in prison and facing various forms of intolerance in other countries. What does advocacy on their behalf look like in a context like this?
Yes, so that's a very good question, but I could just say one example, for example, pertaining to Yemen, and we have Baha'is who are in prison in Yemen at this stage, and sort of one could think, you know, what is a couple of people being in prison, sort of how does that relate in the overall context of the situation of Yemen and the whole humanitarian crisis that is ongoing. but it actually really is so indicative of the state that will come out of this context, and to what extent such a state is able to respect a right of form. And that's why we're so adamantly also pushing this at this particular moment. And what has been very encouraging is actually the response of, in this case, the European institutions, and how much they've paid attention to this, even though they are surrounded by so many other issues that are very pressing and very urgent. But really, just to see the interactions that we've had with them, and also them trying to sort of engage as much as they can locally, has been very encouraging.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to come in on that? Yeah, Giovanni.
Yeah, sorry if I'm taking time. We as non-religious, we are the outsider in this issue, but what we are doing is backing up those religious groups who are creatively adapting to the situation. Groups like I think about Catholics and Christians in general who are celebrating Mass on live streaming. Catholic groups who are praying in-house and are launching a social media campaign to encourage people to pray at home. While on the other side, we see ultra-Catholic and ultra-Christian saying, no, churches should be open. We need to celebrate Eucharist live. And so what we can do, not only humanists, but all interfaith groups, we can put some peer pressure to say the direction is this one and not the other. That's it.
Thank you. And Kristen.
Just at the risk of repeating a theme, the UN's human rights experts, the special procedures from the Human Rights Council, they have been very active during the pandemic. There have been more statements than I have ever seen before on aspects of how the pandemic is affecting human rights and guidance about how to react to it being issued by them. But they also do accept and act on individual claims. So cases of persecution, individual ones, can be brought to their attention, and at the very least, it can result in one more public statement that's legitimized by an international authority, identifying the situation as incorrect, as wrong, and then it serves a basis for all the UN activity that we don't see in public, all the pressure that can be brought to bear on government officials privately. It provides a basis for that to happen. So it's not as if the mechanisms we were using before are all completely, decimated by the movement restrictions that we're facing. There are still ways to advocate for the rights of people. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. And Patrick, over to you.
In a certain way, I think what we are doing now shows a good way of using the crisis, because I think in another time, we wouldn't have been together in this setting now. There would have been conferences where we would have met, but they would have been the exception. And now we are learning to use digitalization to bring people together for more or less ad hoc meetings, things that we wouldn't have thought of before, at least I wouldn't have thought of before. And we hadn't done this sort of webinars before in the Conference of European Churches. Thanks to your invitation, we are here now. So if we carry that on and cross borders more often by digital means, basically, we can do something to promote fundamental rights and freedom of religion, belief, and other human rights, because bringing people together, exchanging information, exchanging opinions, finding ways to work together is the best way to strengthen human rights. And we are now learning how to better do it together.
Well, thank you, Patrick. And I think that's a wonderful note to end on, the value of these sorts of gatherings, which are going to continue to help us flatten the curve if we meet this way, and also better for the planet this way as well. We have just 1 minute remaining. I want to hand it back over to Francesco for any final announcements from him. But I want to thank, again, our panelists for being with us, for their thoughtful contributions. I want to thank all of you who are on this call for your questions. We got to many of them, but not to all of them. But fortunately, the series will continue, and we'll learn more about it from Francesco. Thank you all.
Thank you, Judd. And it has been a very interesting and uplifting discussion. And I would like to thank the chairs and the panelists for their wonderful contributions. Thank you all to the participants also for joining from many places around the world, and despite the time differences. We appreciate your engagement and participation. I would like to remind you of episode 4 of our seminar webinar series that's going to happen next week, 30th of April at 3 p.m. Central European Summer Time, which is Brussels time, as I use on my point of reference here. We will host representatives of the EU institutions, and we'll look at how the pandemic is affecting the debate in Brussels. So we really look forward to having you with us next week. And again, many thanks to the panelists, the chair, and all of the sponsoring institutions. Have a wonderful rest of the week, and we can see you next week. Bye-bye.